It's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show today. My guest is Sheluyang Peng. He goes by Yang. He's a writer in New York City, and you may have seen his byline in a number of publications, but he wrote a very interesting piece for American Affairs Journal called Nietzsche's Eternal Return in America. That was really interesting. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so you can listen to it. I've never read any Nietzsche. I tried once and I really couldn't get into it, but he's big in kind of the discussion. So I wanted to get Yang on the podcast to talk more about Nietzsche's role in American thought and how he's influenced American thought, because it's a really interesting piece. So Yang, thank you for joining me.
Right, thanks, Aaron. And about the point you said about not reading Nietzsche, don't worry. A lot of people who quote him have never read him either. So,
I tried reading. I think it was Beyond Good and Evil, but it kept putting me to
right.
sleep every time I tried to get into it. I just couldn't. I couldn't quite get going on it. But how did you get interested in Nietzsche?
Well, yeah. So I got interested in Nietzsche because I was doing a bit of research on people of my background. Right. So I'm a preacher's kid. Both my parents are preachers, and I got interested in the experiences of people like me. And one of them was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. And I looked at his background, and it was just really fascinating. The son of a Lutheran pastor, and then his father's grandfather was also a pastor. And it was just like a long line of Lutheran preachers. And Nietzsche was also supposed to go into the clergy, just like his father and grandfather. And I've always been asked that as a kid too, like, hey, so your parents are both preachers. Are you also going to preach yourself? And that's something I've thought about a lot, and that's something I thought about Nietzsche about a lot, and that's what Nietzsche thought about a lot too. And his final decision was, I'm not going to go into the clergy. I'm going to do my own thing. In fact, I'm going to reject everything that I've been told. I'm going to reject my lineage to invent my own philosophy. And I thought that was something interesting, just given his background and given my background. And it was just really fascinating to me from that angle, just like going beyond good and evil, going beyond the confines of his Lutheran clerical upbringing to invent this new free spirited philosophy. So that's one part and why I'm interested in Nietzsche. And another aspect is that I think Nietzsche appeals to a sort of outsider who feels like he's not like in sync with the people around him. And in my article, I discuss Sohrab Ahmari and Kostin Alamaru, also known as BAP. And what both of them have in common is that they were both brought from other countries to America while they were children. You know, Amari was brought from Iran and Alamaru was brought from Romania. And, I was also brought from China as a kid. So there's this sort of like outsiderness that I think draws a lot of people to Nietzsche. And it's clear just from the people who are fans of him that such a thing is true.
Yeah. One of the things that you say early in your article, which I did not know, is that there was actually American influence on Nietzsche's thought and that he was an avid consumer of Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'd never heard that. What was Emerson's influence on Nietzsche?
Right. So if you wanted to get the full detail, you can read this book, right? It's called Individuality and Beyond. Nietzsche reads Emerson. It's by Benedetta Zatava, and basically it talks about the impact that Nietzsche had on, I mean, that Emerson had on Nietzsche's early life, because Emerson too, he was also the son of a pastor, and I think Nietzsche related to him from that angle, where it was like, he invented this philosophy that was all about the free spirit. He invented this philosophy that was all about the individuals breaking the confines of a society. Like, I mean, Emerson came from a long line of Puritans. I mean, Puritans were very about, conforming to a set of ideals, and Emerson was kind of reflecting a drift away from that. And Nietzsche too was also reflecting that kind of drift away from everything that he had ever known. And I think that's why Nietzsche was so obsessed with Emerson. And Nietzsche, in fact, when people found his notebooks and found all his books, they noticed that the Emerson volumes in his library were the most annotated There's so many jottings just on on the margins of them because he was just reading Emerson's book so much.
Hmm. Yeah. What are kind of the differences maybe between the American view of Nietzsche and the European view? Because it does seem that there is a strain of American thought that's very in sync with Nietzsche.
Right. So ever since Nietzsche first arrived in America, ever since people first started reading him in America, there was always this question of, is this guy a European thinker who's going to show us Americans what we're missing? Or is he actually an American thinker that already kind of reveals who we are as a people, even though he came from Germany, right? So there's always this kind of debate. And so I think Nietzsche is a very American in his thinking. I think it was influenced by Emerson, right? This idea of like the free spirit who kind of breaks apart from the rest of society and goes on to do his own thing, to create, to make one's own values. And I think that's something that the American spirit has always had ever since, Puritans and Quakers coming over, doing their own thing, manifest destiny, the frontier, go west. It's all these ideas about America of constantly creating, expanding, reinventing yourself, like all these immigrants from Europe, from the old world coming to the new world and then completely transforming themselves into something that wasn't possible in the old world. So I think those are some American values that resonate deeply in Nietzsche's thought.
Yeah, and you say Nietzsche had an influence on kind of America's homegrown school of philosophy, pragmatism. What was that?
Well, William James was Emerson's godson. William James was a philosopher who, I mean, he wasn't the first to talk about pragmatism, right? Charles Peirce and all those others Americans too, where they talked about like truth is whatever is most useful to you. There's no, it was kind of an early sort of, not really postmodernism. You could say postmodernism, but it still said there was a kind of truth, right? Truth was something that could be bent to whatever you can utilize. Truth is something that if it helps you, then you can just say it's true. And I think that's something that Nietzsche also kind of drew at, the sort of rejection of Kantianism, rejection of this sort of universal morality, rejection of Christianity, finding whatever truth helps you.
Hmm. Yeah, and you also say that like H.L. Mencken played a key role in popularizing Nietzsche's thought in America. And he's a really interesting character, very anti-democratic. I think himself in a lot of ways. One of the most, I think trenchant critics of democracy. Also, wasn't a fan of Christianity. I would say, but maybe unlike Nietzsche, maybe I'm being unfair to Nietzsche, but I think Mencken was just an incredible stylist. You can't stop reading H.L. Mencken essays. If you pick up a collection of his book, they're so like lively in a sense. What was the role of Mencken with spreading Nietzsche's ideas in America?
Well, so Mencken himself, he was a son of German immigrants. And so Mencken already could speak German, could already read German, and so he could directly translate Nietzsche's works from German to English. And Mencken, growing up in Baltimore as a son of German immigrants, he also felt like this sense of like being out of place. But then there's two kinds of ways to deal with that, right? One of them is like, oh, I'm so marginalized, and this is what all the like the leftist immigrant kids are like, oh yeah, they'll never understand what it means to be me. Oh yeah, yeah I've been called racial slurs, I've been so oppressed. But man can win the opposite direction, right? He's like, yeah, I'm different from other people because I'm so much better than them. I'm superior, and I'm Nietzschean.
Hmm.
And so he translated Nietzsche's books into English in order to show people this philosophy of this fellow Teutonic thinker who kind of revealed the follies of what he considered to be American democracy, the follies of Christianity, the follies of capitalism, just like things that prevents the formation of higher men, as Mencken would think himself. And Mencken, yeah, he was a great stylist. He was like, if Chesterton wasn't Christian, he would be Mencken. Yeah, he just like kept writing and writing, publishing new books, having his own opinions, and yeah, and he's not that remembered today. But I find his work very interesting, even though he wrote back in like the 1910s and 20s.
Hmm. You also, again, the role of Nietzsche in America is like really interesting to me because I didn't know too much about it. Uh, but you say it played a big role in an infamous early 20th century murder case, the Leopold and Loeb case, which I guess, like Sacco and Vanzetti, was like one of those legendary crimes and legendary trials that was there. So for those who don't know what that is, maybe you can give a brief overview, and then how did Nietzsche affect that?
Well, Leopold and Loeb were these two friends. They both went to the University of Chicago, and they both thought themselves as much better than everyone around them. And so Leopold really got into reading Nietzsche and fantasizing about being the Ubermensch and fantasizing just like about committing the perfect crime. So the two of them were very iconoclastic, right? First of all, the two of them, were gay or bisexual, right? They were in a relationship with each other, and the two of them were also, they tried carrying out petty crimes like shoplifting and stealing, just to kind of test the waters of, oh yeah, I'm outside the confines, I'm outside the morality of this society. We're our own thing. So then they had the idea to commit the perfect crime, right? They were going to kidnap and murder this 14-year-old son, Bobby Franks, son of a wealthy watch manufacturer. And then they were going to get the ransom money while not giving the boy back cuz I mean, obviously he's going to die. But it didn't work out cuz Leopold's glasses dropped while they were killing Franks. And then because they were very unique glasses, funny because like he always wanted to be unique, and so he had these unique glasses. The police identified the two boys as the perpetrators, the two teenagers as the perpetrators, and so they were put on trial for this murder. And Clarence Darrow, who was one of the most famous defense attorneys in America at the time, perhaps the most famous, defended the two, and then William Jennings Bryan, the three-time loser, the three-time presidential candidate and loser, was for the prosecution. And Darrow famously gave a speech where he basically argued against the death penalty for the two because oh, you have to, they were influenced by Nietzsche. All these philosophy professors are teaching kids this kind of thing, and so you should have mercy on him. And it's kind of funny too because the two boys, they were against this sort of compassion, they were against this sort of pity because it was un-Nietzschean, and yet that's what the judge gave to them. He said, okay, we're going to give you life sentences instead of putting you in the chair, putting you in the electric chair. And so one of them ended up being stabbed to death in prison, and the other one actually managed to be released.
Yeah, yeah,
So
he was
yeah,
paroled at some point, huh?
yeah, and then I believe he went to Cuba after that to do
Hmm.
humanitarian work.
Hmm. Wow, that's like crazy. But you also say that like Nietzsche had some influence on Christian thinkers. You know, people who were sort of very publicly Christian, including Reinhold Niebuhr, who was the very famous mid-century theologian, and then also James Cone, who was the father of Black liberation theology. How did they relate to the very anti-Christian thought of a guy like Nietzsche?
Right. So Nietzsche is pretty famous for opposing Christianity, right? Like a lot of people say, oh, God is dead, even though he didn't really mean that against Christianity. He just meant we're seeing a decline in Christian values throughout the West. But he was very anti Christian. He wrote a book called The Antichrist, which was very anti Christian. He wrote many things about how much he hated Christianity. But what he didn't do was provide a sort of proof that Christianity couldn't be true, right? He wasn't like Richard Dawkins or Chris Hitchens or all those other new atheists, which were like, okay, here is scientific proof that God doesn't exist. He wasn't like that, right? He just assumed that God didn't exist, and then he just talked about Christianity from this angle. So now, if I'm a Christian, well, if I do believe that God exists, so I can just read what he has to say about Christianity and think about those things critically without actually not believing in God. And so Reinhold Niebuhr, he was a very famous theologian, a liberal mainline theologian. He was also of German descent. He was also a preacher's kid. And he said about Nietzsche, oh yeah, what Nietzsche says about Christianity is true. Christianity really did, take power away from the strong and give it to the weak. Christianity really was, was founded to make the foolish wise and make the wise foolish, as Paul says in the first book of Corinthians and first letter to the Corinthians. And yes, so just this idea that like Christianity is about supporting the weak against the strong. It's about inverting the values of society through the figure of Jesus Christ, who wasn't like a strong vitalist god like the Greco-Roman gods of ancient times. Jesus was a crucified, emaciated, weak god. And that kind of sort of revealed a sort of inversion of morality. And James Cone too, right? James Cone, he was the founder of Black liberation theology. And so Nietzsche talks a lot about master morality and slave morality, right? So Nietzsche says the old pre-Christian values were master morality, which was, the masters defining morality the way they defined it because they were in power. But then the slaves kind of through Christianity inverted this value system to make the people in power evil and to make themselves good. And so Cone was the descendants of people who actually were slaves, which is interesting, right? Because when Nietzsche wrote about masters and slaves, he was thinking about the Roman Empire and slavery then. He wasn't thinking about American slavery. But Cone found a way. He said, yeah, Nietzsche was right. Christianity is a religion of slaves. God came to earth as a kind of slave and he died on the cross. He was crucified. And Cone writes this in a book where he compares the crucifixion of Christ to the lynching of black men in the American South, and he compared the two images of like, yeah, so God shows itself on these image bearers of these crucified black people on the lynching tree, just like Christ died on the cross. And so there are all these unique, pragmatic American interpretations of Nietzsche, which Nietzsche wouldn't really have thought about in his own context, in his own German context.
Hmm. Interesting. I mean, it's like so many of these little Nietzsche connections. I didn't realize all these people cared about him. Um,
Right, because he was very, very influential ever since the 1890s when his work first came to America. Everyone basically wanted to use Nietzsche for their own ideology because he was like the cool foreign thinker, the cool German thinker whose work just like blew everyone's mind, even though they had no idea like what exactly Nietzsche really meant. They were just like fascinated by his sort of exoticness.
hmm. I guess sort of like Hegel, Nietzsche, as you sort of say, it lends itself to many schools of thought. So there's kind of a left Nietzscheanism and a right Nietzscheanism. And after kind of World War II, kind of the right Nietzscheanism sort of couldn't be talked about anymore. But it's sort of made a little bit of a comeback today. You mentioned Costin Amariu and the character Bronze Age Pervert or BAP, who sort of channeled it. Uh, I want to talk about him, but first, like, what is the role of kind of Nietzsche in America and American politics today in the thinking?
Well, I mean, I feel like Nietzsche in American politics today is mostly on the right instead of on the left, right? So after World War II, there was a big taboo because the Nazis used Nietzsche for their own purposes, and it was kind of suspicious if you were like, I'm on the right and I'm a Nietzschean. So most of the thought about Nietzsche came from the universities, right? There was Walter Kaufmann who translated a lot of Nietzsche's books, and he kind of like took some of the more right wing parts out of it, and he basically said, "Yeah, Nietzsche is this guy who makes us challenge, all our prior thinking and encourages ourselves to remake ourselves in the act of radical individualism." And that was a sort of kind of drift for Nietzsche for decades in academia. But now I've seen this sort of return of a more right wing Nietzscheanism, right? It's more like people saying, yeah, he was this aristocratic radical that challenged leftism. He said leftism was the great leveling. Leftism is just like the ressentiments, is just slave morality. It's the masses wanting to think that they're better than the elites. And so there has been a lot more of a Nietzschean influence on the right these days, especially in the form of like certain elite theory strains on the right, especially represented by BAP.
Hmm. I have heard that he wrote this book. He came on the scene, I don't know exactly when it came out, for a book called Bronze Age Mindset. I'm not capable of making this determination because I haven't read Nietzsche, but I'm told that it's basically just recapitulated Nietzsche, is sort of his thing. How did what is kind of the relationship between, say, Nietzsche and this Bap character, which is, and I think Bap is somewhat of a character. Uh,
Right.
it's not clear how much Costa and Almario himself believes all of it, because he's like very, very, kind of a fan of Hitler, and yet Almario is Jewish. So, like, how serious can he take some of this stuff? You wonder. But a lot of people take it seriously. I'm not saying he doesn't take it seriously, but I think there's some ambiguity in there. Like, where does sort of like Bap and his ideas and Nietzsche fit into the landscape today?
Well, I mean, if you look at into Casanel Mario's history, he's been a fan of Nietzsche for a long time, right? Ever since high school, he was a fan. He was a fan, and in his when he was doing his PhD at Yale, he wrote his dissertation on Leo Strauss and Nietzsche and their and a certain interpretation of Plato, right? So those ideas were kind of present. He thought about these ideas for probably decades now, and so Bronze Age mindset is written aphoristically, right? It's like one, two, three, and it's basically written in the style that Nietzsche wrote in, and it's also written in this sort of like ironic tone. It's supposed to be like it uses like ironic humor to kind of make its point. It's very playful. It sometimes even contradicts itself at times. You don't really know if he's being serious or not. And that sort of playfulness was kind of revealed by Nietzsche himself, right? It was a sort of gay science. It was a sort of, a playful way of thinking about philosophy. Because the word science in German doesn't just refer to like science in English, where it's like, oh, okay, it's about biology and chemistry, because science also includes philosophy, theology. So it includes all those aspects. And it was always a sort of playful, joyous, gay sort of way of doing things. And and that's what Bronze Age mindset also tries to do. It's this sort of it's this sort of joking way of looking at things. And I think it resonated with a lot of people, which I think is why Michael Anton wanted to review it in the Claremont Review of Books.
Yeah, some of these things Nietzsche talks about the last man, yeah, in his book, and Bap talks about the bug man. I think in his book, he's got his term bug man. Is bug man and last man sort of the same thing, or?
Well, so it's interesting that you bring up The Last Man because there was a very famous book written in the 1990s called The End of History and the Last Man. And that was Francis Fukuyama, who was also a preacher's kid. And he basically wrote about how liberalism was a sort of final what was a sort of like final stage of human governance. I mean, he didn't say that liberalism would win, but he said there was no other system that could actually, be more stable than liberalism. And this idea of the last man is just this kind of guy. I mean, it could be a man or a woman that basically just lives for consumption. That basically doesn't have any higher goals. Basically, it lives to sustain himself. He just wants to be happy all the time. He doesn't ever want to feel pain, and he basically, it's like the Matrix, right? He just wants to be blue pilled. He just basically wants to live in this world where everything is provided to him. There's no struggle of any sorts, and that's what Bap kind of says about the Bugman. The Bugman, he hates the well turned out. He hates the beautiful people because they make him look bad. He's motivated by a sort of envy, a sort of resentment, or as Nietzsche called it, a sort of ressentiment, envy of the strong, envy of the powerful, envy of Aryan bodybuilders. envy of people, right wing people, and that's why the Bugman is left wing because Bap says, oh yeah, the Bugman is just jealous of people like us.
Yeah. It's like that was the only one that like jumped out to me. It must be interesting to do like a compare and contrast to those two. But I don't want to spend too much time on BAP. I want to mention another thinker who gets a lot of play today, uh, pr- pr- uh, primarily I think as a result of the fact that he was sort of Peter Thiel's mentor, and that was René Girard. And is this human behavior is driven by mimesis and the scapegoat and all of that. You say there's a connection between Girardian thought and Nietzschean thought as well. What's that?
Right. So Rene Girard was an anthropologist and a literature professor. He was born in France, and he came to America in his 20s. He actually went to Indiana University, I believe. Which yeah. So he was in Indiana for a long time doing his dissertation, and then he taught literature at Johns Hopkins. He taught literature at Stanford, which is where he met Peter Thiel, because Thiel was also a student at Stanford at that time, and he basically and Girard is famous for mimetic theory. Girard, it's pretty simple, right? He says, people want things because other people want things. So at first, Girard didn't use mimetic theory in the context of Christianity or of philosophy. He applied it to novels, right, by Dostoevsky or by Stendhal, where it was like, yeah, so there's like love triangles, there's like people who desire other people and people who desire the same thing. But then he converted to Catholicism, and he slowly started applying his theory to the Gospels, to the Bible, and he basically said, yeah, my theory actually explains all of Christianity, which is a very bold claim to make, right? Which is why
I'd say.
which yeah, like he says, my mimetic theory explains all of Christianity, and it actually shows why Christianity is so special compared to other religions. Where he says, yeah, it's true that other anthropologists say, well, Christianity and other ancient Near Eastern religions, they all look pretty similar, right? They all involve someone who is scapegoated and someone who is sacrificed, and that sacrifice turns the sacrificial person into a god. So Christianity, there's nothing special about Christianity. So Girard says, actually, all those other anthropologists are wrong. There actually is something unique about Christianity, because Christianity was the only one that revealed the innocence of the scapegoat, because everyone saw that Jesus really didn't do anything wrong, and yet he was still scapegoated for his alleged sins, even though he didn't have any sins at all. And it made people kind of see the value of the innocent victim, and that kind of led to the inversion of morality, which, as Nietzsche says, from master morality to slave morality. Girard basically says Nietzsche was the first thinker to identify that the core of Christianity is this sort of inversion of morality from master to slave through the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so Girard builds on Nietzsche to prove that his mimetic theory shows everything about Christianity.
Hmm. Wow. Amazing stuff. I definitely encourage everyone to read the whole article on that. I guess the question I'd have just listening to all of this, and it's something related to what you said about pragmatism. Is it the case that kind of Nietzsche's whatever you want him to be, and that sort of anyone can sort of apply Nietzsche to whatever they want to turn him into?
I mean, that's what American interpreters of Nietzsche have already done, right? So,
Hmm.
so yeah, you could say, okay, well, you're this is the only true sort of, this is what he actually said. But then other people could say, well, he also said that there aren't any facts; there's just interpretations. So anyone gets to define him any way you want. And whether or not that's true or not, I guess it doesn't really matter, right? Because everyone has already interpreted Nietzsche however way they want it. They've interpreted him for basically any ideology that you can think of. It doesn't matter if it's communism or capitalism. It doesn't matter if it's libertarianism or it's fascism, or it's it could be anything. Even Christian, even though Nietzsche was against Christianity, so many Christians have used his work, including me, right? So many Christians have used his work to kind of better understand what Christianity is. What is Christianity's essence? And I think Nietzsche is actually a very helpful thinker in thinking about these questions.
Hmm. What do you think the future of Nietzschean thought is in America? If you have any
I think he's going to
speculations on it.
continue. I think he's going to continue being very relevant. I mean, there's this term Lindy, right? Like something is Lindy if it has already has a long history. It's probably also going to have a long future too, right? So Christianity is Lindy, Nietzscheanism is Lindy. All those things. I think his thought is going to be relevant for centuries, just like Plato or Socrates. His work is going to be very relevant. And I was thinking about an article you wrote about James Davison Hunter, and Hunter himself mentions Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment and how that plays out into like discussions of American society, right? The culture wars, as he calls it, the culture wars in American society. And I think that's very true. And I think Hunter's own use of Nietzsche is actually very helpful to the way we think about Christianity, we think about American democracy, we think about the future of our country, and all those things. I think benefit from a sort of Nietzschean lens, as Hunter has shown, and as many, 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 many other thinkers have shown, as I have shown in my piece.
Well, my guest today has been Sheluyang Peng. He's the author of Nietzsche's Eternal Return in America in American Affairs magazine. I'm going to put a link to that article in the show notes so you can read it for yourself. There's stuff in there we didn't discuss, like as sort of alluded to, Sohrab Ahmari's
Oh
journey
yeah.
with Nietzsche. There's more in there, so you might want to check that out. Yang, thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to come on this podcast.